Have you ever been called a narcissist by somebody that you actually think is a narcissist? Or have you ever wondered if what you've been through really counts as abuse? As a psychotherapist specializing in narcissistic abuse, complex trauma, and a personal survivor of these relationships, I know how common these questions are because I've asked them myself too. And I also know there are 5 statements that actually reveal you've experienced abuse, even if you don't realize it yet. And today I'm going to reveal what those 5 statements are, why they prove you've experienced abuse, and how they show you're not a narcissist, but you are likely dealing with one. If you've been looking for clarity, this is the episode for you. Welcome back to Restoring Resilience. I'm Chelsey Brooke, psychotherapist and author, helping people trust themselves again after narcissistic abuse. Today, I want to talk about something that comes up constantly in my work with survivors. That there are certain things people say, specific phrases, specific thought patterns that immediately tell me they've experienced abuse. Even if they don't have a name for what happened to them, even if they've never used the word narcissist or abuse or hesitate to do so, even if they really aren't sure if what they went through counts as abuse. And these 5 statements are like a fingerprint, identifying you as somebody who's experienced relational trauma, even if you're not sure yet. So I want to walk you through each one of those today, because if you recognize yourself in any of these statements, you have asked yourself these questions before, you've heard yourself say these things, I want you to know you're not alone. This is not your fault, and there is a way through this. So, question number 1 that trauma survivors ask: what did I do to deserve this? And I want to start here because this specific question, it tells me so much about what somebody has been through. And here's what's actually happening when your brain asks that question. When somebody hurts you, when you're in pain, when something feels deeply wrong, your brain goes searching for a reason. You're trying to make sense of what's happening. So this question, what did I do to deserve this, is really your brain asking, why is this happening to me? Like, what is causing this? What is going on? And it's actually your brain trying to protect you. Here's what I mean by that. Because if you can figure out what you did, quote unquote, wrong, then maybe you can fix it. Maybe you can prevent it from ever happening again. So that search for the why is your nervous system trying to create safety. It's trying to stop this hurt or this pain from happening. Now, in a healthy relationship, when something goes wrong, when there's a disagreement, when something happens, you can have a real conversation about it. There's accountability, there's repair. So you don't have to stay stuck asking why or what did I do? But if you're in an abusive relationship and you try to have a reasonable, open, honest conversation about what's happening or how to solve what's going on between you two, you're met with denial, deflection, blame shifting, gaslighting, manipulation, darvo, things like, I never said that. Why are you like this? What is wrong with you? You're so sensitive. You're so overdramatic. Nothing is enough for you. So your brain continues to try to figure it out by searching for what's wrong. And since the narcissist is never going to take accountability, you end up deciding, I guess it must be me. And the more you try to solve things in an abusive relationship, the more confusing it gets. Because the narcissist will always give you new reasons that things are your fault. It's because you think too much, you're too difficult, you're too hard to please, you're too emotional, you're too needy. And even as you try to contort yourself into a pretzel to fix all these supposed things that are wrong with you, the issues in your relationship never get better. And that's because you're not the problem. Because if you've tried everything to make a relationship work and it's still not working, that's not a sign that something is wrong with you. That's a sign something is wrong with the relationship you're in. Because think about all the things that you've done to try to make this relationship work. If it was really you, you would have solved it by now. But it's not, because you can't fix a problem you're not causing. So what I want you to see here is that this question only exists because you're dealing with somebody who will never take accountability. Because if you were with a healthy person and you could work things out and talk things through, you wouldn't even be asking this incessant question of what did I do to deserve this? Because what's happening in your relationship literally would not be happening. Question number 2 that survivor or trauma survivors ask: is this even abuse? So this statement, is this even abuse? It might be the one that I actually hear the most. And even if you haven't asked that specific question, maybe you've asked something very similar. Something like, but they can be so nice. So am I really a victim? or, everybody makes mistakes and I'm supposed to forgive, or they never actually hit me. But here's what I want you to really get here. The doubt and confusion you're experiencing is a symptom of the abuse. Confusion is usually the first sign that you're being abused because narcissists do just enough to keep you holding on and questioning whether it's really abuse. They will calibrate their behavior with incredible precision. Just enough kindness to give you hope, but enough harm to keep you off balance. And they are so masterful, so good at pointing out your supposed flaws while making sure you never feel solid enough to point out theirs. And so this question itself really reveals the type of abuse you're dealing with because most narcissistic abuse isn't physical. It's not something you can point to that you have some kind of physical scar. Of course, it can be physical, but it's usually not. And research shows that people are more likely to stay in relationships where there's only psychological abuse, not physical, likely because you're doubting if you're even experiencing abuse. And narcissistic abuse, by definition, is hidden, it's insidious, it's hard to put into words, which means you question whether it's even abuse because you wonder how can something be abusive that you can't even put into words or can't even describe. But that's exactly how narcissistic abuse feels. So with that in mind, I do think it's important for you to be able to articulate what narcissistic abuse is. I want to empower you with that language. So after collecting over 400 stories for my best-selling book, If Only I'd Known, and doing this work for over a decade and being a personal survivor myself, here's the definition of narcissistic abuse I came up with. Narcissistic abuse is a multi-layered attack on your sense of self. It's a dismantling of who you are and what you believe you're worth, and it includes consistent and repetitive manipulative tactics used by narcissists to meet their ego needs and gain control over your emotions, perceptions, and thoughts. And what this definition reveals is that narcissistic abuse isn't just one thing. That's why it's hard to put into words. And it's hard to put into words on purpose because narcissists abuse you most effectively when you will relabel their abuse as a misunderstanding. So the more you question or doubt what they're doing is actually abusive, the more effective their abuse becomes. So this question, is it even abuse, exists because of a very specific and very intentional feature of narcissistic abuse, that it's almost never physical. It lives in the gray. It lives in all the ways that they make you feel less than without directly criticizing you. It's the look of disgust they give you from across the room. It's a sigh that makes you feel like you've done something wrong, but you don't know what it is. It's being showered with love one week and being completely ignored the next. It's having your memory questioned so many times, you start to doubt whether you can even trust your own mind. Because when there are no physical bruises, it's incredibly easy to convince yourself that nothing happened, that you're overreacting, that you're just too sensitive. And we know, of course, that's what narcissists and abusers are telling you too. But I want you to keep something in mind because there is a scientific reason you can feel like you're being abused even when you don't have bruises. And that's because the same part of your brain lights up when you're emotionally hurt as when you're physically hurt. That is right. The same part of your brain lights up when you're emotionally hurt as when you're physically hurt. That's why you can feel internally bruised, beaten up, even if you can't see anything on the outside. So your brain is literally validating the fact that emotional abuse is abuse because the brain is registering the emotional harm in the same way that it would physical harm. The third statement that reveals you've experienced abuse. But I wasn't perfect either. This one is really important to talk about because I think most survivors hesitate to call what they're going through abuse or feel very guilty for saying that somebody is abusive or narcissistic because it feels like you're not taking accountability or you're making excuses for yourself. So basically, if you weren't perfect, then you don't have a right to call it abuse because maybe I did something to deserve it. Maybe I pushed them to treat me that way. Maybe they wouldn't have said those things if I would have been better. Maybe they wouldn't have yelled at me if I were more patient and loving. Maybe they wouldn't have cheated on me if I would have had sex with them more often. Maybe they wouldn't have betrayed me if I hadn't been so distant and stressed with work and the kids and all the things. So you can start to hear the pattern here. Basically, if I had been good enough, fill in the blank, whatever that means, then they wouldn't have treated me this way. Now, if you're listening to this and shaking your head in agreement, like, yeah, I've had that thought, or you're thinking, yeah, exactly, what if I caused this? That's just another sign that you've experienced abuse. because that kind of thinking comes directly from the abusive strategies that have been used against you. And the abusive tactic that makes you feel like it's your fault is called DARVO. It's a type of gaslighting, stands for deny, attack, reverse victim and offender role. Every narcissist does this. And once you fully see what it is, you realize almost every conversation is an example of DARVO. And it's a manipulation strategy where the abuser flips the narrative so much, you end up apologizing. You end up feeling responsible. You end up focused on your own supposed flaws or imperfections or things that caused it instead of their behavior. So these are the conversations you walk away from thinking, what in the world just happened? How did we go from here to here? I was trying to bring something to their attention, trying to clarify something that they did, and now I feel bad. I feel like I did something wrong to them. That is an example of DARVO. And over time, this is incredibly effective. It is an incredibly effective abusive strategy because you start to think, maybe they're right. Well, I mean, if I hadn't said that, if I had just been more patient, if I wouldn't have bombarded them with this question when they walked in the door, if I would have waited until they were in a better mood, they wouldn't have treated me like that. So accepting blame starts to feel like accepting the truth. It starts to feel like self-awareness. Oh, I see what's happening here. I see why they did that. When really, it's the result of being in a relationship where you are the only one who is willing to take accountability. Because with a healthy person, this would never have happened because they don't blame their bad behavior on you. Now, I know that can be hard to wrap your mind around if you haven't had a healthy relationship. And I would encourage you to go check out the other two podcasts I did, part 1 and 2, on green flags and what a healthy relationship really feels like. Because healthy people don't blame you for how they act. If they did something, if they yelled at you, if they said something out of line, they don't blame you for their choices. They don't blame you for their actions. They would take accountability for that. So you would be able to leave those conversations with your reality intact because they would have taken responsibility for their part. With a narcissist, that will never happen. So again, the fact that you have believed this idea that the reason you're being treated poorly is because of something you've done or you're doing wrong is because you're being abused, because that's exactly the mindset that an abuser conditions you to have. The fourth statement that shows you've been abused: maybe if I had just tried harder. This one feels really true. I resonate with this one deeply, being a perfectionist myself from my own childhood trauma. It feels very true when you've been abused because of the cycle of abuse. Something that really keeps people stuck in the relationship or going back to the relationship is because it's not all bad. There are good moments, good days, a kind gesture, a relaxing date night, a seemingly well-intentioned text. And these dips in the abuse, in the bad times, make you question everything. In fact, I've heard many survivors say, and I felt myself, when they're nice, that's harder. Like I wish I just had a physical bruise. I wish they would just be mean all the time. That would make it so much easier. And of course it would, because then you wouldn't have this back and forth. You wouldn't have this rumination. But that's why narcissistic abuse is so insidious and so hard to identify and pinpoint, because it's not always going to be bad. And when there's these dips, when they seem to get it, when they seem to be nice, you start to question hard. Well, can they really be that bad? If they can send a text like this, if they give me that kind of compliment, if they can be reasonable about that, maybe I am just making a big deal out of everything else. But that's because you're misunderstanding what these dips in the abuse really are. They're not genuine good moments. And then the times when they yell and they criticize you are just when they're stressed and having a bad day. The good moments are also part of the abuse. It's just the cycle of abuse. Because think about it. How hard would it be to leave a relationship that was always bad? That's like I was saying. It seems like it would be so much easier if they were just mean all the time, if they were just critical all the time. It's the supposed good moments that keep you hanging on, that keep you questioning everything, that keep you hoping that things can be different because you feel like you have these moments of proof where things are different. But that's just a cycle of abuse. And abusers know that. They can sense when you're pulling away, when you're starting to question things, figure out their tactics. And that's exactly when they will seemingly out of the blue, now somehow they understand things they've never been able to understand before. They start doing things you've asked them to do for years or decades. And that's what keeps you stuck. And then what happens? We know the cycle starts again because the niceness only lasts for so long, and then they're back in the same behavior. And you know why? Is because they didn't really change. That wasn't really a genuine change in their behavior. They just sensed they were losing control and changed tactics until you started to believe them again. And that's why you keep saying, maybe if I would have tried harder. Not because it's true, but because their abuse has conditioned you to think that way. And the fifth statement that shows you've experienced abuse: no one will believe me. Now, let's just think about for a minute, what would even lead you to ask a question like that or to say something like that? If this really was a normal, healthy relationship with just basic communication struggles, why wouldn't somebody believe you? I mean, nobody who's experienced basic relationship struggles walks away from those conversations thinking, no one is going to believe what just happened here. Because you're dealing with something that's actually quite common, something you've probably talked to your friends about, know that they've experienced something similar, something you can walk away from knowing what happened. Like, you know what happened, you know the miscommunication or the argument that you're having. Like, you can put it into words. Even if you're not sure how you're going to solve it, it's not something that seems so jumbled in your head. Another reason you feel like no one will believe you is because narcissists will directly tell you no one will believe you. And this phrase alone reveals a lot. It is actually an admission of their guilt, an admission that they know exactly what they're doing because they know how they're treating you would not be accepted by others, which means they know their behavior is wrong. It is also a deliberate isolation tactic. So by saying this, they're warning you not to even bother telling anybody. And the reason it works is because they've carefully crafted this different image to the outside world as an amazing mom, a loving husband, a great spouse, a wonderful parent. And they know there is a gap between how they treat you in private and how other people perceive them. So, in other words, they're openly admitting they're two-faced. So, when a narcissist says no one will believe you, they're confessing they know exactly what they're doing. And the tragic thing here is that you're often not believed when you start telling people about what's happening, likely because you're telling people who think that they know the narcissist. So, y'all might tell somebody who's kind of close in your circle, another family member, a friend, and they know one version of the narcissist, the nice version, and you know the real version. So when you open up to them, they're like, I just can't see them doing that. They've never treated me like that. Are you sure? They seem so nice. You're so good together, though. Hear all those things. Or you tell somebody who knows nothing about abusive dynamics. Or you tell somebody just bits and pieces of what's happening because you're afraid of not being believed. So then the other person really doesn't get the full picture or the seriousness of what you're going through, which those times when you're not believed or not understood pushes you further into silence and further into denial that what you're experiencing is abuse. But again, no healthy person would say to you, no one will believe you. And you wouldn't feel like no one would believe you if you were having basic, normal relationship issues. So let's bring this full circle and give you the takeaways from today. If you've ever asked yourself, what did I do to deserve this? That question exists because you're with someone who will never take accountability. If you've wondered, is this even abuse? That confusion is a symptom of the abuse. If you've thought, but I wasn't perfect either, that's not self-awareness. That's what abuse conditioned you to believe. If you've told yourself, man, maybe if I had just tried harder, that's the cycle of abuse talking, not the truth. And if you felt like no one will believe me, that feeling is proof of just how real and serious what you've been through actually is. I know these feel like random thoughts, and oftentimes survivors really question themselves even more for having them. But these thoughts, these statements, these questions are fingerprints that prove you have experienced abuse, and now you can see them for what they are. And here's what I want you to take away from today. The fact that you're asking these questions doesn't make you a narcissist. It makes you someone who has been hurt by one. Narcissists do not question themselves like this. They don't wonder if they're a narcissist, if they're a problem. You do because you're not. You're not broken. You're not too sensitive. You're not crazy. You're somebody who deserves to heal. And more importantly, you can. I have worked with survivors of all ages, even up into their 80s, and they're learning new things. They're healing in ways they never thought possible, and they're creating a life built on hope and empowerment from the clarity and validation you can get from listening to things like this. Then if you'd like to experience that change for yourself, but you're hesitant, you're unsure, you feel like you need a roadmap or some guidance to get there, I invite you to check out Rewired for Resilience. This is my program designed specifically for people like you, people who are done doubting themselves and you're ready to start trusting yourself again. And you're also going to be surrounded by a community of people who get it because they've lived there too. And you can find that link in the show notes. I want to thank you so much for being here today, spending this time with me. I know your time is precious, so I don't take that for granted. And until next time, remember that no matter where you are in your healing journey, resilience can be restored, and we'll keep building it together. So I'll see you in the next episode.